You know the story. October 8th, 1871. A barn on the southwest side of Chicago. A cow, a lantern, and the beginning of one of the most famous disasters in American history. The Great Chicago Fire burned for 2 days. It destroyed more than 17,000 structures. It left 100,000 people homeless. 300 people died. And in the century and a half that followed, it became a permanent fixture of American cultural memory, the subject of books, films, documentaries, school curricula, and a legend about a cow so durable that it survived every factual correction thrown at it. 300 people. The legend is real. The grief is real. The destruction was immense. Now let me tell you what was happening at the exact same hour, 250 miles north, in a place called Peshtigo, Wisconsin, while Chicago burned in ways the newspapers could document, photograph, and telegraph to the world. A different kind of fire was consuming the forests and settlements of northeastern Wisconsin in ways that defied description, that destroyed every record of itself as it moved, and that killed somewhere between 1,200 and 2,500 people in a single night. The range of that estimate, 1,200 to 2,500, is not imprecision or carelessness. It is the honest acknowledgement of a tragedy that was so complete it erased its own evidence. The town records burned. The church records burned. The census materials burned. The people who might have corrected the count burned, along with everything else. In some areas, the bodies were so thoroughly incinerated that investigators could not determine whether the remains were human or animal. More than 350 people were buried in a mass grave, because there was no one left in those communities who could identify them. The Great Chicago Fire killed 300 people. The Peshtigo Fire killed between 1,200 and 2,500. The conservative estimate is 4 times the death toll of Chicago. The probable estimate is 8 times. The high estimate is more than 8 times. And almost no one, outside of Wisconsin, has heard its name. That is not an accident. The story of why Peshtigo was forgotten is as important as the story of what Peshtigo was. And understanding both requires going back to the summer of 1871, to a drought that was already, by June, stripping the color from the landscape of the upper Midwest. Peshtigo in 1871 was not a famous city. It was not a major economic center in the way that Chicago was. It was a logging town, a productive, prosperous, genuinely thriving logging town, but a logging town nonetheless. Population approximately 1,700, 2 sides of the Peshtigo River, connected by bridges. Its economy was built on the seemingly inexhaustible white pine forests of northeastern Wisconsin, and its ambition was the ambition of every frontier American settlement of the era, to turn natural abundance into manufactured wealth as fast as physically possible. The town was home to what was, at the time, the largest wooden products factory in the entire world, owned by Chicago millionaire William B. Ogden, who was simultaneously watching his Chicago properties burn from 250 miles away, while his Wisconsin investment was being consumed by an entirely different fire. Ogden's factory in Peshtigo produced everything from clothespins to furniture to barrel staves. It employed hundreds of men. It was the economic center of the region, and it was made entirely of wood, as was every building in Peshtigo, as were the sidewalks, as were the roads. The streets were literally surfaced with wood chips from the sawmill, and the mattresses in the workers' dormitories were stuffed with sawdust. The entire town was, in the most literal, structural sense, a manufactured extension of the forest around it. Trees came in, products went out, and every surface in between was covered in the most combustible material the 19th century knew how to produce. The summer of 1871 was one of the driest in the recorded history of the Great Lakes region. By July, leaves were falling from trees that had not yet turned color, the forest equivalent of a body shedding weight under extreme stress. By August, the harbor masters on Lake Michigan were using foghorns, not for fog, but for smoke. The air over the water was so thick with the particulate from dozens of small fires burning across the landscape that ships could not navigate by sight. Loggers in the forests around Peshtigo were familiar with small fires. They were a tool of the trade. Burning, the practice of setting fire to the branches and debris left behind after a section of forest was cleared, was standard operating procedure for the logging industry of 1871. Railroad construction gangs used the same technique to clear corridors for the tracks they were laying westward across Wisconsin. Small fires were managed. Small fires were expected. Small fires in a dry summer were unremarkable. By the first week of October, the smoke hanging over Peshtigo and the surrounding townships was a permanent feature of daily life. People had grown accustomed to it. They knew there were fires burning somewhere in the forest. They knew the season had been dangerous. Smoke in the air was not alarming in itself. It had been present in some form since midsummer. The harbor masters on Green Bay had been using foghorns to warn incoming ships, not about fog, but about visibility impaired by smoke. The air had the persistent smell of wood burning somewhere not far away, but small fires were familiar. Small fires were managed. Small fires were what you had when you ran an industry that stripped millions of board feet of timber from the landscape every year, and left behind enormous volumes of cut branches, split wood, and sawdust. The logging industry of 1871 operated without any concept of fire risk management. The value of the forest was in the standing trees. Once the trees were down and the marketable timber extracted, everything else, the branches, the bark, the slash, was waste. It was left where it fell. Loggers did not haul away their slash. They did not spread it out to reduce density. They did not create fire breaks or wet lines around the perimeters of cleared areas. They left the slash in deep, compacted piles throughout the forest, where it dried across months of drought into fuel with the character of a manufactured explosive. The sawmills took the trees and produced mountains of sawdust. Sawdust that was spread across the streets of Peshtigo as a surface material, used as floor covering in the factories, stuffed into sleeping pallets as insulation. The railroad construction gangs, building their way westward through the forest, used fire to clear corridors for the tracks, and they left their own piles of burned and half-burned slash alongside the rights-of-way. The entire economy of northeastern Wisconsin in 1871 was engaged in a systematic project of converting standing forest into an enormous prepared fire. All it needed was the right weather. What was failing to happen, almost entirely, was any serious engagement with the risk this created. The people of Peshtigo were not stupid or reckless in some individual sense. They were doing what the economy of their era required them to do under a regulatory framework that did not yet contain any concept of industrial fire risk. There were no laws governing slash disposal. There were no federal forest management programs. There was no systematic fire prevention infrastructure anywhere in the United States in 1871. The idea that an industry had an obligation to manage the fire risk created by its own operations was not a legal concept that existed. The risk was as visible as the smoke in the air over Peshtigo every morning that summer, and as ignored as the creaking rivets on the Boston molasses tank, and as unfixable, given the constraints of the moment, as the structural failure brewing in the tank's steel walls. What was happening, though, in a different part of Wisconsin? In an office in Milwaukee, at a desk belonging to one of the most accomplished scientists the state had ever produced, was that someone was paying attention. Increase Allen Lapham was 60 years old in 1871, a largely self-educated naturalist, geographer, and meteorologist who had spent decades studying the climate and geology of the Great Lakes region. He was the kind of scientist that the 19th century occasionally produced, a person of extraordinary breadth and discipline who worked, for much of his career, without institutional support, without university affiliation, and without the recognition that his contributions deserved. He had studied the weather patterns of the Great Lakes since his arrival in Milwaukee in the 1830s. He had written foundational work on the flora of Wisconsin, on the archaeology of the mound builders, on the hydrology of Lake Michigan, and in 1869, he had successfully petitioned Congress to create a National Weather Observation Service, arguing on the basis of his own decades of research that the Great Lakes states experience storm conditions so severe and so predictable that the failure to monitor and communicate them was costing ships, cargo, and lives every winter season. The National Weather Service was established in February 1870. By October 1871, it had been operational for barely a year and a half, and its observational network was nowhere near complete. It did not cover the northern Wisconsin forests. It did not have stations positioned to monitor the atmospheric conditions that were building over the landscape around Peshtigo. In the weeks before October 8th, after the fire, Increase Lapham wrote a report to the Chief Signal Officer of the Army, documenting the fire weather conditions that had prevailed across an enormous swath of the northern United States that autumn. He was the only person, in any official capacity, who understood what had happened from a meteorological standpoint, and who tried to ensure the record of it was formally preserved. His report described fires burning from the Rocky Mountains through Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and into New York and Pennsylvania. A catastrophic fire season that had consumed millions of acres, and that the country, distracted by the spectacle of Chicago, had never fully registered as a national emergency. What was failing to happen, almost entirely, was any serious engagement with the risk this created. The people of Peshtigo were not stupid or reckless in some individual sense. They were doing what the economy of their era required them to do, under a regulatory framework that did not yet contain any concept of industrial fire risk. What was happening, though, in a different part of Wisconsin, was that someone was paying attention. Increase Lapham was the only person who fully understood what the autumn of 1871 meteorologically meant, But the system for translating that understanding into warnings that could reach the residents of Peshtigo before October 8th did not yet exist. By the first week of October, the smoke hanging over Peshtigo and the surrounding townships was a permanent feature of daily life. People had grown accustomed to it. They knew there were fires burning somewhere in the forest. They knew the season had been dangerous. What they did not know, what they could not know, because the meteorological understanding of what was building in the atmosphere above them did not yet exist in a form that could generate a warning, was that a massive cold front was approaching from the west, carrying with it the conditions for something that had never been formally named or documented. A firestorm, not a wildfire, not a forest fire in the sense that word implies. A firestorm, a phenomenon in which a fire grows large enough and hot enough to generate its own weather system, drawing in oxygen from the surrounding air with such force that it creates sustained winds of hurricane intensity. A firestorm does not behave like a normal fire. It cannot be outrun in the way that a normal fire can be outrun. It does not merely consume what is in its path. It reaches ahead of itself through superheated air that kills before the flames arrive. It creates fire tornadoes, actual rotating columns of flame, the fire equivalent of a waterspout, that throw rail cars and buildings through the air as secondary projectiles. It produces a roaring sound that survivors uniformly described in the same terms, across dozens of independent accounts, like a freight train, like a waterfall, like nothing they had words for, because they had never encountered anything like it. At approximately 9 in the evening, on October 8th, 1871, the cold front arrived. What happened next requires a brief detour into the physics of fire, because without understanding what a firestorm actually is, how it differs from a very large forest fire, the scale of what happened in Peshtigo is impossible to fully comprehend. A conventional forest fire spreads through fuel. It moves from tree to tree, from brush pile to brush pile, advancing at the speed of burning material. Its rate of travel is limited by the fuel available and the wind that drives it. It is dangerous and destructive, but it is comprehensible. It obeys, roughly, the logic of combustion that human beings have been observing since the invention of fire. A firestorm obeys a different logic. A firestorm is, in the most precise sense, a fire that has become large enough to generate its own meteorology. When a fire burns across a sufficiently large area with sufficient intensity, it heats the column of air above it to temperatures that cause that air to rise rapidly. As the superheated air ascends, cooler air rushes in from the surrounding environment to replace it. But because the fire is consuming oxygen at an extraordinary rate, the incoming air accelerates far beyond the speed of any natural wind in the area. The fire creates its own wind. That wind feeds more oxygen into the combustion. The combustion intensifies. The column of heated air rises faster. The incoming air rushes in harder. The feedback loop is self-reinforcing, and once established, essentially cannot be stopped by anything except the exhaustion of fuel or a dramatic change in atmospheric conditions. The temperatures at the center of a fully developed firestorm reach above 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. That is hot enough to melt iron. It is hot enough to incinerate human tissue so thoroughly that bone fragments are indistinguishable from soil, which is precisely what investigators discovered in the aftermath of Peshtigo when they tried to count bodies in the areas closest to the fire's center. The wind speeds generated by a major firestorm reach hurricane force, sustained at 60 to 100 miles per hour in the Peshtigo event, with gusts sufficient to throw railroad cars from their tracks and lift wooden buildings from their foundations and carry them as flaming debris into areas not yet burning. And the fire tornado. This is not a metaphor. In several locations during the Peshtigo fire, and most notably at Williamsonville, survivors and the physical evidence both documented the formation of actual rotating columns of fire tornadoes, technically called fire whirls, driven by the firestorm's internal wind dynamics. A fire whirl is indistinguishable in its mechanical behavior from a conventional tornado, except that instead of rotating air, it contains rotating flames. It destroys everything in its path, not by burning, but by the combined force of heat, wind, and the physical impact of the debris it carries. Father Peter Prunen, the Catholic priest, serving the parishes of both Peshtigo and the nearby town of Marinette, was the most articulate eyewitness to survive the night, and his written account, published in 1874, 3 years after the fire, remains the primary narrative source for what happened in Peshtigo between 9 and 11 on that October evening. Father Prunen had been aware of the fires in the surrounding forest for weeks. He had noticed, as everyone in Peshtigo had noticed, that the smoke was thicker than usual in the days before October 8th. He had sensed something that he could not have articulated in meteorological terms, but that his body registered as a difference in the quality of the air. The stillness before the front arrived. Then the wind changed. Father Prunen wrote that he first noticed, above the dense cloud of smoke that had been hanging over the town for days, a vivid red reflection of immense extent in the sky. Then came a sound, distant at first, then growing with terrifying speed, that he compared to the roar of a freight train approaching at full speed. Then the air itself changed, not warm, not hot in the ordinary sense, something beyond hot, a superheated blast that hit the skin like an open oven door, thrown wide, and then the light. Survivors described a wall of flame that witnesses estimated at a mile high and 5 miles wide, moving across the landscape at speeds they later described as anywhere from 60 to 100 miles per hour. Father Pernin also wrote something that stayed with him long enough to commit to paper 3 years later. And that gives you, more than any physical description, the particular texture of what the Peshtigo firestorm was. He wrote that when he turned his gaze from the river, the direction of safety, the direction of the water, and looked in any other direction, before him, or to either side, or upward, he saw nothing but flames. Not the edge of a fire, not the approach of a wall of fire, with some sky visible behind it. Nothing but flames. In every direction, except the river. The sky itself had been replaced by fire. The atmosphere above Peshtigo in those hours was fire, and the only human geometry that had any meaning was the boundary between the fire and the river water below it. In Peshtigo, there was no time for organized evacuation. There was barely time for instinct. People grabbed their children and ran. Men who had been sitting in the company dormitory at 9 in the evening were outside and running toward the river within minutes of the fire's arrival, and many of them did not make it. The town, every wooden building, every wood-chipped road, every sawdust-filled sidewalk, was consumed in under an hour. Father Pernin, in his account, describes turning in every direction and seeing nothing but flames. Not fire in the distance. Flames on all sides, as though the entire envelope of the world had been replaced by fire. The Peshtigo River became the refuge. Hundreds of people threw themselves into it, immersing their bodies below the surface to escape the superheated air. Horses and cattle crowded in alongside them. A 13-year-old German immigrant girl, separated from her family, grabbed onto the horn of a cow and held on through the night as the fire burned the bank above her. Other survivors described men and women holding their children below the water's surface to shield them, not knowing whether the people they were protecting were still alive. Some who reached the river drowned in the crush of the crowd. Some survived the fire, but died of hypothermia in the frigid October water before morning. In one account that historians have cited repeatedly, and that speaks to the complete psychological rupture of the event, a man carried a woman to safety through the burning streets, believing she was his wife. When he discovered she was a stranger, he lost his mind entirely. The fire had not only destroyed the town. In several documented cases, it had destroyed the capacity of survivors to remain coherent in the face of what they had witnessed. In the small village of Williamsonville, about 15 miles from Peshtigo, a fire tornado, an actual rotating column of flame driven by the firestorm's internal winds, hit the settlement directly. Of 76 residents, 19 survived. Williamsonville was never rebuilt. A county park now marks the site, named for the tornado that ended it. Meanwhile, 250 miles south, the city of Chicago was burning, and the world was watching Chicago. The telegraph line out of Peshtigo had been destroyed by the fire. The nearest working telegraph station was in Green Bay, 45 miles away, and the first person to reach it and transmit the news of what had happened in northeastern Wisconsin did not arrive until 2 days after the fire. 2 days. The governor of Wisconsin, Lucius Fairchild, was already in Chicago when the news reached Madison. He had traveled south on the night of October 8th with a train car of relief supplies to help the survivors of the Chicago fire. His wife, Frances, 24 years old, was the one who intercepted the news about Peshtigo, stopped a supply train headed for Chicago, and rerouted it north to Wisconsin. She organized blanket drives in Madison. She coordinated the first relief response to a disaster that the rest of the nation would not fully register for weeks. Because by the time the news of Peshtigo was reaching newspaper offices in New York, the story of Chicago was already in its second edition. The Great Chicago Fire had something that the Peshtigo fire permanently lacked: an infrastructure of visibility. Chicago was a major American city, one of the most economically significant in the country, connected to every other major center by telegraph lines that were not in the fire's path. Within hours of the blaze beginning on October 8th, correspondents were transmitting stories to papers across the country. Within days, photographs were being made of the destruction. Within weeks, the story was being told in the form that American cultural memory has sustained ever since: the story of a great city destroyed and rebuilt, of resilience and ingenuity and economic renewal, of tragedy transformed into triumph. The cow and the lantern became the legend, not because they were proven true, but because they gave a vast and impersonal catastrophe a human face and a simple cause. Legends that have a face are the ones that survive. Peshtigo had no face. It had Father Pernan's account, published 3 years after the fire, in French, in Montreal, ostensibly to raise funds for the reconstruction of his church. It had a brief report in the Wisconsin legislature in 1873, listing 1,182 names of the dead or missing. It had the mass grave in the town cemetery, where more than 350 bodies, many of them too charred to be identified as male or female, let alone named, were interred together. The town was rebuilt, over years, with significant help from donations that poured in once the news finally reached the broader public. But Peshtigo had no Mrs. O'Leary. It had no building that became famous. It had no narrative that compressed the catastrophe into the kind of story that could be repeated at school, that could anchor a particular date in the calendar of American memory. What it had was a paradigm. The combination of conditions that produced the Peshtigo firestorm: drought, industrial logging, / multiple small fires already burning, and the arrival of a cold front with high winds, has been formally named by fire scientists the Peshtigo paradigm, a model of how catastrophic firestorms develop that is now foundational to the study of wildfire behavior and prevention. And here is the fact about the Peshtigo paradigm that should not be a footnote to this story, that deserves its own weight. In this account, the American and British militaries studied the Peshtigo fire during World War II. Specifically, they studied it to understand how to recreate the conditions of a firestorm during bombing campaigns against cities in Germany and Japan. They built scale models of wooden urban neighborhoods and studied the physics of the fire tornado. They used the Peshtigo firestorm, the deadliest fire in American history, the fire that no one remembers, as a blueprint for the incendiary bombing of Tokyo, Dresden, and Hamburg. The firestorm that killed 2,000 people in a forgotten Wisconsin logging town became the research foundation for some of the most devastating military operations of the 20th century. That fact has never been prominently featured in any national memorial to the Peshtigo fire. It is mentioned, quietly, in academic and military histories, but the connection sits there, uncomfortable and undeniable. The forgotten fire became the template for deliberately setting fires of similar magnitude and character in populated urban areas. The physics that the residents of Peshtigo could not escape in 1871 was reproduced deliberately, with scientific precision, in Tokyo in March 1945, killing approximately 100,000 people in a single night. There is one more figure in the Peshtigo story who has been almost entirely erased from the public account, and who deserves to be named. Increase Lapham was a Wisconsin scientist and meteorologist, perhaps the most distinguished scientist in the state's history up to that point. A largely self-taught man who had spent decades studying the weather patterns of the Great Lakes region, and who, in 1869, had successfully argued to Congress for the creation of a National Weather Observation Service. He was, in the most direct sense, the intellectual father of what would eventually become the National Weather Service. Increase Lapham understood, before October 8, 1871, that the atmospheric conditions over the Great Lakes region were unusually dangerous. He had been tracking the drought. He had been observing the pressure systems. He was the only person in the state, and possibly in the country, who fully understood the unusual and dangerous nature of what was building in the autumn of 1871, after the fire. He wrote a report documenting the catastrophic conditions across the entire northern frontier, from the Rocky Mountains through Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and into New York and Pennsylvania, and submitted it to the chief signal officer of the Army. His warning came after the fact, as all such warnings do when the system for communicating them does not yet exist. The National Weather Service he had helped create had been established only 2 years earlier, in 1870, and was not yet operational in a form that could generate public alerts. The infrastructure to translate Lapham's understanding into a warning that would reach the residents of Peshtigo before the cold front arrived on October 8th did not exist. It would take the Peshtigo fire and the national reckoning with how inadequately the country understood its own atmospheric risks to help build it. The Peshtigo fire did not produce the kind of immediate, visible, legislative reform that disasters in populated cities tend to produce. The lumber industry continued operating with the same slash-and-burn practices in the decades following 1871 Wisconsin. Itself experienced major fires in 1880, 1891, 1894, 1897, 1908, and 1910. The rate of industrial logging increased, rather than decreased, in the years after Peshtigo, as if the fire had been understood as an argument for accelerating the harvest, before the forests were destroyed by accident anyway. The single most consequential structural change that came from the Peshtigo fire was gradual, institutional, and largely invisible to the public. The fire contributed to the arguments of early conservationists, specifically Franklin Hawk and later Bernhard Fernot, who cited the Peshtigo disaster to persuade Congress that federal forest management was not an aesthetic preference, but a public safety necessity. Their arguments eventually led to the creation of the Division of Forestry and, ultimately, the United States Forest Service. The Peshtigo Fire is one of the founding events of American conservation policy. That it is remembered as such only by specialists in conservation history, and not as a broadly known chapter in the national story, is its own commentary on how the weight of a disaster is measured less by how many people died than by whether those people died in a place that the country's information infrastructure was designed to notice. The cemetery in Peshtigo is still there. It is on the National Register of Historic Places. It was the first site in Wisconsin to receive an official state historical marker. The mass grave is marked. The names that could be recovered are recorded. Several thousand people visit the small Peshtigo Fire Museum each year, housed in a former church building on Oconto Avenue. The museum has artifacts from the fire tools, melted metal, fragments of the structures that survived, which was almost nothing, and first-person accounts and photographs of the aftermath. Next to the museum is the cemetery. In it lie more than 350 people whose names are unknown, buried together because when the morning came after the fire, there was no one left in Peshtigo who knew who they were. 1,200 to 2,500 people, an area twice the size of Rhode Island, 17 communities destroyed. A death toll that is still, 150 years later, uncertain at its margins, because the fire burned the records that would have made the count exact. The deadliest fire in American history, the deadliest wildfire in world recorded history, occurring on the same night as the event that America remembers as the Great Fire of 1871, 250 miles south, in a city that had telegraph lines. The Great Chicago Fire killed 300 people. The Peshtigo Fire killed at least 4 times that, and likely much more. If you want America to remember the name that the country decided, over a century and a half, was not worth keeping, leave the word Peshtigo in the comments. Because the history that gets forgotten is not always the history that mattered least. Sometimes, it is the history that mattered most, in a place that was too far from the telegraph lines for anyone to notice in time. And if you want to understand how the same pattern, a disaster that was preventable, that generated the knowledge to prevent future disasters, and that was then quietly filed away by an industry and a government that preferred to continue doing what they were already doing, plays out in a different context, in a different era, with different industries and different victims, and the same logic of production over precaution. The video on this screen will feel familiar in the worst possible way. It is there right now. Watch it.